Over the top lecture talking about production. I've been through how the theory of demand doesn't make any sense at all because the SMD condition that showed that well, there's many reasons the theory of demand doesn't make any sense, but one of them is that even if it does, it doesn't even let you derive the micro of a single market, let alone the macro of the entire economy. They try to do from DSGE modelling. And the Marshallian level, which I went through last week, perfect competition itself is a mathematical error, not a theory, it's a mistake. The Kornal stuff doesn't help anyway, but that also, again, I didn't go into that in last week's lecture, but the basic story there is that the Kornal-Nash equilibrium way of deriving perfect competition actually works. There's no mathematical errors in it, but the trouble is it's only stable in a one-off shot. So if you think a single gamble can emulate competition, good luck to you. But of course, there's more than one trade, and of course, what they call the repeated dilemma comes through forward, and it comes in that situation, and therefore the Nash equilibrium goes off from being the state where they both defect effectively, or where they both cooperate. What cooperation really is, as I've shown in another paper, is simply ignoring all other firms and just iteratively working out what's the best way to profit maximise for you. And that will lead to the same equilibrium I showed that applied when the Marshallian error is corrected anyway. So there's no real foundation even to the Kornal approach. Once you've got that, the reason neoclassical economists obsess so much about perfect competition, because it's the only way of getting a supply curve that's independent of the demand curve, because only if the sum of the marginal cost curves for all firms is the supply curve for all firms can you have an independent supply curve from a demand curve. Now, there's another issue I didn't cover there, aggregating the output of many small firms to making the same as one large firm, which your lecturers blithely do on blackboards all the time, or whiteboards all the time, is mathematically constrained as well. And it only applies either where marginal costs are constant, which of course undermines the theory to begin with, or where there's some bizarre condition applying where the costs of each firm depend upon the number of firms in the industry, which is also madness. So I go through all that in other papers. So there's no supply curve, and you can't do Marshallian theory anyway. Now, what I want to cover as well is the theory of production and why that's also dysfunctional. So actual production, which we take for granted as economists, we don't actually go to the factory, we don't work in them these days, we can get jobs if we get any part-time job that can be in service industry these days rather than process lines. It's a very, very complex process. You have, for a start, you use multiple goods to produce any given commodity, and you combine them in factories using very, very complex machinery and labour, both skilled and unskilled. And you're also, in using it, you're exploiting free energy. Now, I don't mean the energy costs nothing, but the fact that the energy exists in the first place is not something the capitalist system can take any credit for. It was something which was laid down in the period of development of coal and oil and so on over many millennia, many millions of years. And it's also the energy landing in from the sun. And of course, the fossil fuels we're exploiting now are themselves biological products that wouldn't have existed there were it not for the energy landing from the sun. So in that sense, it's free energy. Now, one thing which economists don't have enough understanding of by a long shot is the thing called the second law of thermodynamics. Any of you heard of that before? Okay. It's one of the first things you learn if you do a course in physics, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment in this particular slide. But going back to production itself, the reality of production involves extremely complicated feedbacks. For a start, you have to have that free energy coming in from initially coming in from the sun. And that's if you look at the physiocrats, which is, in my opinion, the first really worthwhile school of economic thought, their theory about where production came from, net production, produit net. I'm doing my best to pronounce French, which is appalling. That's what they call the produit net came out of the sun. And they saw agriculture as a source of surplus because agriculture received that sunlight directly, and therefore agriculture trapped the surplus from the sun, and the rest of production just distributed. That was their model. Even though they're wrong about where surplus comes from in a capitalist economy, they were quite right to see the sun as the essential source of production being feasible. Without that free energy landing from the sun, not only would there be no capitalist production system, there'd be no humans to begin with. So that's an essential step. Then on that, you've got all the goods being produced in a production system, and some of them are worn out through depreciation, so the capital wears out. Some are consumed, but a lot are produced as inputs back into production itself, so the intermediate goods. And you wouldn't actually have production unless you were then using some elements of the outputs to produce themselves as inputs into the next sector. So the computer I'm working on here obviously includes products that were made in a previous period of production out of oil. Otherwise you wouldn't have the plastics that are part of the whole, the base that we actually have for semiconductors. A huge part of them, again, consuming elements that were produced in previous production periods, probably define production. Innovation is also going on, and that tends to be left out of neoclassical thinking in any really intelligent way. And most importantly, this waste, that's why I'm emphasising it very heavily in that little graphic there. So this is the second law. These are the laws of thermodynamics. One, you must, for zero rather, the very first law, you can't not be caught up in thermodynamics. If you're a living entity, if you're in the universe, you're affected by the laws of thermodynamics. First law is you can't win. In other words, all that says is always going to be waste in the system. You can't come out ahead. You can't make a net gain. That comes down to saying that there's no such thing as a source of perpetual motion. There's no way of generating energy, creating it out of nothing. Then it said number two is you can't break even. That's the key law. There's some complex elements of proving that and showing what it actually means. But fundamentally, producing anything must involve waste. And the third one is you can't get out of it. You can't leave the game. You've got no choice. So a great little humorous summary of the three. I've got a couple of links there to definitions on Wikipedia. But the key one is waste is necessarily generated by production. Now, the overall thrust of the second law is to say that the degree of disorder grows over time. Energy degrades, effectively. Now, if you think about yourself, you are yourself a local reversal of that law. The fact that you're living and breathing and getting in detailed complex structure is a reversal of what we call the second law. And production itself is the same thing. This computer was initially made out of a whole range of what things you can reduce back to being unprocessed oil, silicon, metals stuck in ore systems and so on. And then out of that you produce, which are very disordered when you think about them. You might have crystalline structure for metals, for example, but it's a long way from the crystalline structure of metals in ore to something as complex as this. So we've actually made this is less disordered than the ores from which it was made. But the only way that's feasible, fitting with the second law of thermodynamics, is if we create even more disorder in the waste process. That's where you say you can't break even. So to have production, which is a local reversal of the tendency for disorder or entropy to rise, there must be a greater increase in it elsewhere. So there's a necessary link between production and environmental degradation in a very general sense, because the environment may, in some scales of our output, be able to cope with that quite easily. In the level we're at, clearly it's not coping. So that's a fundamental part of production, and again, economists ignore that, don't probably take that into account in their modelling. So the economic theory of production reduces that very, very complex process with all sorts of feedbacks tied up in it and all sorts of interrelations to the ecology into something that's very simple without feedback. And it's not just neoclassicals who are guilty of this. I can say my own models start off by doing something as simple and therefore as wrong as this is. You say you have labour and capital as inputs and you get goods as outputs. And that applies to post-Keynesian theory, to Marxian theories, to Austrian theories as well, in many ways. Now, there are some approaches that try to go beyond that. So a group called Sraffa economists, called up by other people largely, but people who follow on the work of Piero Sraffa in his 1960 paper, The Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, they have attempted always to model the multiple input-output nature of production. And people have worked in input-output dynamics using Leontief matrix analysis. They're also looking at that more complex feedback process that you need outputs to producing, inputs become outputs become inputs in a production system. They do look at that. Most theories abstract from that. Now, so the neoclassical aren't alone in making this first abstraction. Where they are alone, or they have what I call a signature way of treating this particular simplification of talking about labour and capital in, goods out, rather than goods in and labour in and goods out, is first of all they argue that labour and capital can be smoothly substituted for each other. So you get the idea of production functions, where they're seen as being substitutable elements in production. If you don't have enough particular type of capital, for example, the jackhammer, then you can throw more workers at it who can dig holes with their hands. I'm deliberately choosing a bad example there. They then all talk about diminishing returns and what they call labour and capital factors of production, and say that if you want to increase output, you can add one or the other, but what you will get as a result of that is diminishing returns as you add more of one input to a fixed quantity of the other. So that's more goods output from more factor input, but at a diminishing rate. And they then also argue that the marginal product, the change in the output you get for a change in the input, whatever it is, labour or capital, is equal to the wage. Okay, the marginal product times the wage. So you get the marginal product of the labour is the real wage, and marginal product of capital is the rate of profit. Now, what you get out of that, and this is again not emphasised enough in neoclassical tuition, is that that's the whole basis of the idea of rising marginal cost. If you don't have diminishing marginal product, you don't have rising marginal cost. The link is complete because of the way the theory argues about applying perfect competition in the factor market as they define perfect competition. So production occurs in the short run. You're not looking at a long run process here. And by the short run, they mean a period in which some crucial input can't be varied. Now, it's normally capital they use for that, but if they use it completely symmetrically to derive the return on capital. So they can argue about labour not being easily varied, which I think is clearly empirically nonsense compared to when you say machinery can't be varied, but that's nonetheless how the theory works. So they say it's a short run, you can't vary one input, normally capital, so you add a variable factor, which is labour to that fixed factor of capital, and therefore you'll get rising output rising at a diminishing rate. Now again, because they assume perfect competition, which I've shown doesn't apply mathematically at all, but they assume that, they're saying therefore that the firm that's producing output doesn't have to pay a higher wage to get more labour input. In fact, you can get a similar result from Keynes by saying that you get as many workers you'd like at the going money wage, okay, until you reach full employment. So at less than full employment, you can get a similar thing about constant input costs out of a more Keynesian view. But what you get out of the neoclassical is the idea you're going to get a diminishing output per unit of input. So each additional worker will add to production, but less than the one beforehand, and therefore marginal cost will rise. So here's the logic. You've got some ideal ratio between machines and labour. Now let's say we're looking at workers to jackhammers. Well, the ideal ratio there is obviously one worker per jackhammer digging holes in the road. Now in the short run, the firm is assumed to have a fixed number of jackhammers. So it's got all these jackhammers lying around. That's its fixed capital. And it's got just one worker. Now to dig holes, what the firm does is tells that one worker to use all 6 machines at once. Now that sounds stupid to you. Good, because it is stupid. Okay? Clearly that's not what the worker would do. The best way that one worker handles one machine and leaves the other 5 idle, which is part of where you get constant returns to scale in the short run coming out of it. But the theory they have is as if, because you have all these fixed capital, 6 jackhammers, one worker's out there running 6 at once. Now, initial workers will give you an increase in productivity per worker for a while, so you might actually, because the one worker doesn't have to balance 6 machines at once all running simultaneously, 2 workers doing it, you might get more than an increase, more than a doubling of output out of the 2 workers, etc., etc. But ultimately you get to the stage where you've got the ideal ratio of 6 workers for 6 jackhammers, so they're all happily digging holes. They're all plugging away. But if you want to increase output even more than that, well, you've got to hire more workers. So now what you start having to get more efficient, to get a large level of output, is you have more than one worker per jackhammer. Okay? It's a jackass theory. So up you go. Productivity then starts to fall. You're getting more holes dug for each additional worker, but less holes per worker than you were getting beforehand, and that's therefore going to give you rising marginal cost. So that's the basis of the theory of rising marginal cost. It's also why the theory is clearly wrong, even in the short term, because of the assumption about what the capitalist does with all this machinery, which is simply stupid. As you'll see, people working in firms who have had this theory explained to them later strictly regarded the theory as not just stupid but insulting to industrialists. So that diminishing marginal productivity gives you rising marginal cost. And the main mathematical form that economists give to this, neoclassical economists give to this proposition, is the Cobb-Douglas production function, which says the quantity produced is some function of the technology applying at a particular time, given by a coefficient alpha, multiplied by the number of workers you hire, raised to some power, beta, multiplied by the amount of capital, number of jackhammers in this case, raised to the 1 minus that power, 1 minus beta. So let's just put it back up again, hang on a sec. That's the overall expression there. So that it's not the only one they use by any means, but it's the most popular form for a neoclassical production function. Now, that allegedly fits the data very well, but I think a bit of a clue here. It's an excellent paper by Anwar Sheikh, which he calls the humbug production function, which goes through why it isn't quite as good as it appears to be, the particular fit they get. I'll give you an example before I go into the logic behind that. Here I've got alpha being 10. The number of K for these are index numbers, obviously, rather than actual numbers of machines. So K being 100, beta being 0.4, and I've got the labour you can employ, which is the variable factor, which would be between 0 units of labour and 250. You can imagine it being 100, if you like, 100 jackhammers and between 0 and 250 workers handling them. So what you get when you put that graph together, that's the sort of output function you get, and there's your production function with diminishing marginal productivity showing up in the fact the slope is getting flatter as you add more and more workers. And it's right from the very initial level. So there's, say, with 100 workers, you produce 1,000 units. With 250 workers, you produce 1,443 units. So the very large marginal jump between the two, the change in output in going from 100 workers to 250 is 443 units. So you get an average of about 2 per worker over that range. Let's be the find of that. Let's take a look at the mathematics first of all. The marginal product of labour is then the slope of that curve with respect to the change in the amount of labour. So there's your overall function. Q equals alpha times L to the beta multiplied by K to the 1 minus beta. And you differentiate with respect to labour, and what you now get is the marginal product of labour, which is the QDL, and that will be just, it's a straight quadratic type expression here, rather than being beta is now beta minus 1, and you multiply by the beta factor out the front. Now that's exactly the same expression for quantity, multiplied by beta and divided by labour. That's going to give you a falling curve over time because the amount of output per worker is going to fall. That's the productivity argument. So that will be still positive, but falling as labour rises. So beta is a positive term, Q is positive, L positive. They're all going to be positive, but because Q is a function of L, and you're dividing it by L, it'll be falling over the whole time. That index, L to the beta minus 1, is going to be less than 1. Okay? So it's dividing by. So marginal cost will rise, and marginal cost is going to be that invert the marginal product. So rather than the Q to L is now the L to Q, the change in physical numbers of workers inputted for each physical change in the number of outputs produced, multiplied by the cost per worker. And that will give you rising marginal cost now because you've got the quantity not rising as rapidly as the labour does. And if you graph the marginal product, you first of all get, just to show this in terms of marginal product first of all, let's say there's 49 workers, your output is 752 units. With 50 workers, it's 758. So you've added about 6 units, precisely at 6.06 units. And that's the marginal product curve on the red one going up. But on the, that's the total product, the total product was the red curve going up. The blue one going down is the marginal product per worker. So I'm reading those off various points. When you get to 99 workers, you produce 996 units. With 100 workers, you produce 1,000, roughly a marginal product of roughly 4 at that level. So diminishing marginal product as you add more and more workers. And that's the basic logic. That therefore gives you rising marginal cost because you're still paying the same wage per worker, you're getting less output per worker, therefore the marginal cost is rising. And what you do effectively is flip the axis. So rather than graphing the labour output input on the x-axis, you now put it on the vertical. You're saying, well, given the level of output, which is on the horizontal now, how many workers do I need to hire? And just read it in reverse. So if you want 1,000 units of output, then you're going to have 100 workers. So you do that little bit. And then you multiply that by the wage rate to work out the variable cost at that level. Let's say it's $12 an hour. And then you get a graph like the one I'm showing over here. So that's that basic logic. I'm not going to go much more on that because let's take a bit more detail look at the actual idea of, first of all, of the Cobb-Douglas production. I've already pulled apart the idea of profit maximisation. They got that wrong. What about the theory that marginal cost rises? The whole logic comes down to diminishing marginal product. Without that, you don't get rising marginal cost. Now, often neoclassicals will say, well, whatever you might think about the theory, we've got a model, the Cobb-Douglas production function, that fits the data pretty well. And you'll see Mankiw in a reference I'll provide later. I haven't actually put a link in this set of slides yet, but I'll do it before I pass it on to you. Mankiw used that justification back in 97, saying it reassures him to find just how well the Cobb-Douglas function fits the data about production. So there's the Cobb-Douglas function yet again. Let's take a good look at it. Why does it fit the data so well? Well, it's got no choice but to fit the data extremely well. It's a statistical certainty that it'll fit very, very closely, because all it's really doing, and this is where my shapes work and also my economies work, brilliant, really useful work. Simon's also played a role in this too, by the way, I heard Simon's. All the Cobb-Douglas production is a complicated rearrangement of the argument that income equals wages plus profits. Now look at let's take that accounting identity. If we look at in real terms, say real income is wages plus profits, taking out the effect of inflation from the whole thing. So you're going to say quantity produced is going to be either consumed by workers or consumed by capital. So that's looking at it in real terms. And if we say there's an average real wage and an average rate of profit, then you can expand that and say the quantity in terms of income now will be equal to real income, real wage times the number of workers you hire, plus the rate of profit multiplied by the real value of capital. Let's take a rate of change of it. It's just complicated, but it will show you where why the whole thing works so well and therefore works not at all. So differentiate that. You're going to dq dt is going to be the differential of this expression plus the differential of that expression. And then what you get is you've got to apply the product rule. Okay, you get W times the LDT plus L times the WDT plus R times the KDT plus K times the RDT. You get 4 terms coming out of that. Now let's make more sense of it, and let's make it into, that's just the slope. That's the slope of quantity with respect to time. Let's now differentiate it and get it in percentage terms, percentage rate of change of output. So divide through by 1 over Q all the way through. Now I've got W over Q times the LDT plus L over Q times the WDT, blah, 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 all the way through to those 4 terms. Now let's make everything in a percentage rate of change. The way that I do that, percentage rate of change of some function is 1 over the function multiplied by the differential of the function with respect to time. So let's multiply by L over L. I've got almost all the information I need here. This is one little trick that I was taught by a fantastic math lecturer I had when I did my undergraduate degree called Williams back at Sydney University. He said there were 3 laws to mathematics. We actually said 2, but I think we've got embellished to say there are 3 rules to mathematics. Rule 1 is what have you got in the expression that you don't want, get rid of it. Rule 2 is what have you not got that you want, put it in. And rule 3 is keep it balanced. This is basically doing that same little trick. So I'm multiplying each of the terms by L over L, W over W, K over K, R over R. So I can change anything, multiply it all by 1. But now I can shuffle that around because what I wanted to do was to get an expression that brought in percentage rates of change. So that's what I've done there. But I've done with this L here I want to get rid of. So I was going to transfer it across to multiplying it by the term beforehand. So rather than have a WQ times L over L, I'm going to W times L over Q multiplied by 1 over L dl dv, and it'll become percentage rate of change. And that applies for each of the terms in the expression. Just for those watching on YouTube, they've got W over L over Q there, and there's the percentage rate of change of labour, percentage rate of change of wages, real wages, etc., etc. Now, having done that, something interesting turns up because all the terms on the right-hand side now include either the worker's share of output, which is this expression, or the capitalist share of output, which is this expression. And since they sum to 1, I can now say, well, the worker's share, I'm going to define to be omega. I think that's the right term. Is W that omega? I don't know my Greek all that well. Sometimes I stuff up. And the capital share is going to be 1 minus omega. Pi of 1 minus omega. So I can simply bring that term in there that I can substitute all the way through. So I'm going to substitute it. So I'm now saying percentage rate of growth of quantity is going to be omega times the percentage rate of growth of labour plus omega times the percentage rate of growth of real wages plus 1 minus omega percentage rate of growth of capital plus 1 minus omega times the percentage rate of change of the rate of profit. That's what the whole expression means there. This is leading somewhere. Don't fall asleep just yet. Okay. I don't know that it is here, but I thought I'd throw that in for good measure. Okay. Now, one thing we know empirically about capitalism is that even though income shares do change, they change relatively slowly. So if you look at the workers' share of output back in the 1950s in America, but also Australia, it was of the order of 55-60% of GDP. By the mid-70s, it was about 70%, and it's been downhill ever since, back down to the same sort of level again, so up and down. But no trend and not a rapid rate of change compared to the profit share or the real wage at different times and so on. So you can actually, let's just pretend that it's not a bad first assumption that omega is a constant. And if we do that, then I can actually integrate that term. There's a trick in integration again, great little trick. We're saying, as well as saying 1 over, that's being the percentage rate of change, 1 over f df dt is the percentage rate of change of the function f. That's also equivalent to the differential of the log of f. So I can use that substitution to say that I can now replace 1 over f df dt with the differential of the log of f dt. And therefore, if I integrate that, I cancel out the differential as well and I'm left with the log of the function. This is a trick you've used quite frequently in econometric, you'll find as well. So that means, for example, the integral of 1 over q dq times dq dt is going to be the log of q. Now, you apply it to both sides of the equation I gave you beforehand, treating omega as a constant, otherwise this wouldn't work. You'd need to know what the actual functional form was for omega, which could be quite complicated. You get this expression, and it's a reasonable approximation. Okay? Not a perfectly accurate thing, a reasonable approximation. Log of q is going to be omega times log of L plus omega times log of W plus 1 minus omega times log of K plus 1 minus omega times log of R. Now, we also know that a constant times the log is the log of the variable raised to that power. So I can take the omega inside the log of L and the 1 minus omega inside the log of K and R. And then I can take exponentials of that side, of course, cancel the logarithms. So now I've got q, back to q again, it's a complicated procedure, but there's a reason to doing all this, is now the exponential of all these logs added together. And again, we know that if you want to add logs together, it's the same as multiplying each of the independent exponentials. So I'm going to say the exponential of the log of all this is the exponential log of L raised to the omega, multiplied by this, multiplied by that, etc., etc. So having done all that, of course, the exponential and the log cancelled each other out as well. So I can now say that q is the log L labour raised to the omega multiplied by W raised to the omega, multiplied by K raised to 1 minus omega, multiplied by R raised to 1 minus omega. Okay. Does that look like anything you've seen beforehand? Let's rearrange it. Let's say Q is going to be equal to omega W raised to the real wage raised to the power of omega, multiplied by the rate of profit raised to the power of 1 minus omega, multiplied by L to the omega times K to the 1 minus omega. Well, that's pretty bloody close to a Cobb-Douglas production function. In fact, it's going to be the same if alpha, this first bit, is omega W raised to the omega multiplied by R to the 1 minus omega. And omega is equal to wages share of output, which is the beta in the previous Cobb-Douglas function. But I've derived that working straight from an accounting identity with just one assumption, that the income shares don't change rapidly and therefore I can integrate and treat omega as a constant. Okay? That's all I've done. Now, given that omega is in fact reasonably constant over time, that'll have to have a good fit with the empirical data for output because it's the same bloody equation. You're regressing x against x. No wonder it has a high R squared. If you got a low R squared, you'd be in real trouble. So it doesn't empirically validate, and this is the way the Neoclassical often interpreted the thing, because Cobb-Douglas fits the data so well, therefore it justifies their theory of income distribution and theory of production. No, it doesn't. It just shows that the expression is income equal wages plus profits is correct. It's not a production function at all. Now, one thing that economists talk a lot about is what they call the solo residual, because when they actually try to calculate and see where does growth in output come from over time, rather than growth coming from the change in labour or the change in capital, they found it actually came from the alpha term. And so I haven't followed this literature closely, but there's found to be lots of complicated empirical work of people throughout the world trying to work out the value of alpha. And the other people who have done this critique, this work I've been showing you here, Anwar Sheikh and John McCombie, actually went, I think, one step too far in their work, because they worked out a complicated way of substituting for alpha. Now, in playing this through for you guys yesterday, I just thought I'd stick with it without actually finding some other term for it. And I realised that maybe it would be possible if somebody wanted to try an interesting honours or master's, perhaps a PhD thesis. Maybe you can take some of these really complicated econometric studies and try to work out what they call the solo residual, the measured technological changes. Maybe you can actually work it out just by saying, okay, give me an index value of the real wage in some country and give me the data for the rate of profit, and tell me the income shares there, and I'll tell you what your solo residual is. But it might not even be anything to do with technology. It might just be an artifact of how they mangled the data. So there's a little potential. Anybody want to try that on YouTube? Give it a try. Okay. Now, that's the theory. What's the reality inside firms? Well, you would not know it from doing an economics degree. There's been something in the order of 150 or so empirical surveys, starting right back in the 1920s, 1930s, of the actual conditions of production inside corporations, saying, what are your costs of production like? It began with a thing called the Oxford Economic Research Group, and what's his first name? Fred Lee does a brilliant job in a book called Post-Keynesian Pricing Theory, where he goes through all this literature over tremendous historical literature showing how all these study groups began. And the Oxford Economics Research Group was an attempt by economists at Oxford University, obviously, to get out there and get their hands dirty with the real world and talk to businessmen. And they held their first couple of meetings where the businessmen were supposed to learn from the economists and vice versa. And the businessmen could not make head or tail of what the economists were talking about. Because unlike today, when you can't get a job as a hamburger flipper at McDonald's without an economics degree, back then almost nobody had an economics degree. So if you worked in a firm, you most likely had a degree in engineering, or it could be in biology or some science area. Maybe you did French and Latin, but you certainly didn't do an economics degree in the vast majority. So when they tried to communicate with each other, there was complete failure to understand each other. And most of it related to the whole idea about rising marginal cost. because the economists just took that for granted. All firms would have to have rising marginal costs, and all firms would find that they would have some output level that maximised their profits. And the whole concept of rising marginal cost and some maximum output level didn't make any sense at all for the industrialists. There was real confusion between them. But out of that, you've got a range of economists who actually woke up and said, hey, maybe our theory doesn't really make sense in the real world at all. Maybe we need to go and ask firms what they actually do. So people like Hall, Hitch, Means, Eiteman and Guthrie, etc., went out there and did the research and actually asked firms what their cost structure were. Now, the last person to do it, the name blinded me. He's an I think he was vice president of the Federal Reserve. He was president of the Eastern Economic Association, I believe. And there's certainly nothing near being a vice president of the American Economic Association. So very well respected, very well placed, new Keynesian economic modeler. Alan Blinder, being a new Keynesian, believes prices are sticky. That's the main distinguishing feature between them and classical. So classical believe prices adjust rapidly. New Keynesians believe they don't. Whammo, a huge controversy about nothing amongst neoclassical economists. They think the entire economic debate. But to give Blinder his credit, he said, well, prices are sticky. Let's find out why. So he commissioned a study, and he did a very, very good study back in 1998 published. And he surveyed a substantial number of firms in the northeastern segment of the United States. We actually worked it out what proportion of America's aggregate GDP in the survey. I think it was somewhere like 15 or 25% of America's output was covered by the firms he surveyed. So a huge proportion of America's industrial output there. Anyway, I'll go back to Blinder a bit more detail later. But in all these surveys, about 95% of firms report the following. First of all, the marginal revenue and cost are irrelevant concepts that don't have any meaning inside normal factories. Every extra sale adds to profit. So rather than having some maximum output level you try to reach, and that's it, you don't bring up, rather you don't stop there. There's nobody whose job it is to stop the salesman selling. Okay? Sell every unit you can sell, the more you sell, the more profit you make. Average costs fall with output. Fixed costs are very high, and very marginal costs, where you define them, are constant or falling for most firms. And prices are set by putting a markup on average costs. If you actually set the price the way neoclassicals think, you'd actually be losing money. It simply doesn't happen that way. And firms also operate, rather than operating at their margins, so being with fully employed capital, and therefore not having any spare resources, they're always operating well within capacity. Those are the sorts of real-world rules that have been found by all these surveys. Now, my favourite one of these studies was published by Eiteman and Guthrie in the American Economic Review in 1952. And what they did, they sent out a mail survey. Most of these things were mail surveys. They sent out managers a set of hypothetical cost curves, and this is the cost curves they drew. Now, you can note that they're saying here's a scale of output on the horizontal, how many units you're producing, and the cost per unit on the vertical. And they gave all those various curves 1 to 8 and said, please identify the one that most typifies the cost structure you have. And of those curves, only 5, 6, and to some extent, 3, 4, and 5 to some extent are like neoclassical cost curves. Notice this one, that's pretty much your Matthew textbook cost curve. Okay? You get a minimum level of cost well within the full capacity of the firm, and then rising after that. 4, you get it close to a maximum output, then rising. 5, you get it really close to maximum, it's still a rising bit. 6 and 7 is sort of neoclassical, but only marginal, but only at the very end you start to see rising costs. And 8, of course, is not, 7 and 8 aren't neoclassical at all, because if this 7 falls right out to maximum capacity, and 8 slowly tapers and bends at a low cost all the way out. And they described them as well and said, 5, you have a high unit cost at minimum output, declining gradually to a least cost point near capacity, after which they rise sharply. That's 5. Because 3 is much more likely to see in the textbooks. Take a good look at your textbooks and see which curves they mean. Now, there's 6, high minimum output, etc., and then 7, and so on and so forth. So those are the cost curves that firms were given. to say which ones look like your cost curves. And this is the answers they gave. Almost nothing, 3, 4 and 5 of the survey for the neoclassical cost curves. 18 out of the more than 300 responses fitted the neoclassical vision of diminishing marginal productivity and therefore rising marginal costs. Those three. They fitted the neoclassical vision. Almost 2/3 argue they've got the lowest unit cost at maximum output, which is 7. Okay. So 6 and 7, those were the cost curves that were more typical of most firms. And that's not an aberration. Generally speaking, only 5% in all the surveys, we'll go over about 140, 150 surveys, only about 5% of companies reported rising marginal costs. The other 95% said you're going to have constant or falling marginal costs. Now that means you don't even get to first base on this idea about maximised profit by equating the two, because marginal cost has to be rising for that to work, even with the formula, the modified formula that I use. Otherwise, you can have average costs which are above your marginal cost. And therefore, if you set your price equal to marginal cost, or marginal revenue marginal cost even, you probably find yourself losing money. So out of the survey that Eiteman went through, you found that 18 supported the neoclassical vision, 316 didn't. And they gave you about 5.4% in favour by firms and 5.7% by the products they were looking at. So what on earth happened to diminishing marginal productivity? Well, the argument that Eiteman put forward, and Guthrie and Co and all the others ultimately, that engineers design factories. And the way they're designed is just like that example I gave you for jackhammers beforehand. You have it designed in such a way that you have idle capital up until you get to capacity. And therefore any new labour coming in works with idle capacity, with idle capital, and therefore you get a constant level of productivity per new worker until you hit capacity. Only when you get to that level. So you said that point is, in fact, you design the plant so that it'll give you the maximum possible efficiency when it's working at maximum capacity. And if you start getting anywhere near maximum capacity, you have a boardroom meeting saying, maybe it's time we build a new factory. And so by the time you get within reach of that new factory, you've already got a new factory ready to open. You don't even hit the maximum capacity in the old factory before you move on to the new one. So given that, average variable cost declines right out to capacity, and therefore the marginal cost curve is going to be below the average cost all the way out. And as Eiteman concluded, it makes it physically impossible for an enterprise to determine a scale operation by equating marginal cost and marginal revenues. Doesn't make sense at all. Can't do it. And the beautiful thing is how some of the manufacturers who hadn't been tainted by doing an economics degree themselves in their youth, as you guys are now, commented. And this is a manufacturer actually saying that seeing neoclassical economics as a left-wing conspiracy, which is hilarious. But that's how else can you understand this attitude? I'd say the amazing thing is that any sane economist could imagine those curves represent business thinking. It look as though they're assuming a premise that business is not progressive. They see it as pretty much assuming business is stupid, therefore you're critical of business. But in fact, neoclassical economists think they're pro-capitalist. And then another one saying that even if you had to pay overtime wages to get people to work back at full capacity, you'd still get declining costs most of the time, because using your fixed resources more efficiently would give you a greater increase in efficiency than the decline in efficiency of hiring less effective workers or paying a higher price per worker. So goodbye the idea that marginal cost falls because marginal product rises because marginal product is not falling to begin with. Now, the person who first saw this intellectually, prior to a lot of the research being done, was Sraffa, and I've regarded him as one of the truly great minds in economics. And he said, well, to get the concept of diminishing marginal productivity, you've got to have the idea that there's some input to production that's fixed in the short run, and one that's variable. And that gives you the rising supply curve. And then the supply curve also has to be independent of demand, as I've shown beforehand, to give you supply and demand analysis. Now he said he disputed the whole idea that there was some fixed factor in the short run. And he said, look at this in two ways. You can define industry very broadly. So I can talk about agriculture as an industry, and therefore talk about capital, and I'm talking about everything from combine harvesters to sheep dips, a huge range of different forms of technology. He said, well, if that's the case, if you define it very broadly, and you therefore say you want to produce more output of agriculture, then let's say in fact you're talking about is agricultural land, then you've got to convert land which is non-agricultural, land on the outskirts of the city. You've got to make it into agricultural land. Well, that means you've got to buy that land off somebody who's currently living in it. And to do that, you're going to be driving up the price of land. And therefore, you're going to be changing the pattern of demand. And that'll change the distribution of income. So therefore, you've got to, even without the logic I've shown you beforehand, you will have a way in which increasing demand for the factor drives up its price. And therefore, you can't derive a supply curve independent of the demand curve. So that broad definition rules out the theory, because you can say if you're talking about agricultural, land at that level, and you want to expand the amount of land you're devoting to agriculture, then yes, it's pretty reasonable to say the land is fixed and that there's a set amount of land available for agricultural use, and to bring land that is not being used for agriculture is going to be expensive. So yes, it's fixed, hard to change, but therefore you can't get independent supply and demand curves. On the other hand, if you define industry narrow, so say you're talking about making cardboard boxes, and one of your capital items therefore is a stapling gun, then you can't say the number of stapling guns is fixed, because you can easily get other staplers, extra staplers from other industries, or you have spares lying around yourself. There's no difficulty to go and get them, but from getting them, if you have to buy them off another industry, you're not going to have much impact on the price of the other industry. So, and there'll be trivial impact on the demand for cardboard boxes, that's all there. But therefore, you can easily, if you need more workers, and you've got to hire, I think in my example earlier, you need more workers, you've got to hire more, you can hire them more easily, not a problem. So you're going to have a one-to-one ratio. You're going to have a linear function of output because you'll get the jackhammers you need along with the extra workers by hiring them off some business that hires them out, or getting them off somebody who's not using it at full capacity, and so on. So your marginal product will be constant and cost of constant. And that's what factories report. But that's not the only reason that firms have constant returns. I'll show you another one from Kornal in a short while. We'll take a break before we do that. So Sraffa said it's either you have independent supply and demand curves where there's a different demand curve for every industry. That's where we talk about a fixed factor, and it makes sense in a large scale. So yes, okay, you might talk about a rising supply cost then, but each point of the supply curve is going to correspond to a different distribution of income, and therefore a different demand curve, and you simply can't reach a conclusion. Or it's going to be, yes, you can say that there's interdependent curves, but your labour input is going to not be with a fixed amount of capital, but labour input and your capital will vary. So you're getting constant returns coming out of it. And when you work that out, you're going to get a horizontal supply curve. Constant marginal cost. You're not going to get rising marginal cost. So you can't have it both ways. That was Sraffa's brilliant critique there. With constant marginal cost, you've got falling average cost. And you've got the sort of cost curves that managers actually said they do face, being the ones that apply in industry. So Sraffa put it this way, and this is again pretty much what this said to themselves. They regard themselves as being subject to competition, but they don't believe they've got monopoly by any means. But they consider absurd the assertion that the limit to their production is to be found in the internal conditions of production of their firm, saying that therefore they can't produce any more output without facing an increase in cost. They said the chief obstacle they have is not the cost of production, which generally favours them, but having this flog of a larger quantity. The hard part is getting the demand for the extra output you can produce. And let's take a break there, and I'll talk about Kornal's argument about analysing capitals from this point of view when we come back. Thanks, mate. Okay, next up, into Janos Kornal. I very embarrassingly, I think 20 years ago, was on a Marxist discussion group when I was doing my master's thesis, and somebody asked what had happened to Kornal, and I thought, I think he may have passed away, and I got an email about 2 weeks later saying reports of my death have been vastly exaggerated. That was 20 years ago almost. He's still alive and kicking and still writing papers and still sending me material, which I'm delighted to see. I get one of the truly great conceptual thinkers in economics. And he was originally, pardon me, Jonas, if I get this wrong, but Hungarian, and talking about Soviet industry and why it failed compared to Western industry at the time when it was becoming obvious that the Soviet system was growing less rapidly than capitalism. If you go back to Khrushchev's great speech at the United Nations where he took his shoe off and was thanking company saying, "We will bury you," the belief at the time was that the industrial growth of the Soviet would be so much greater than the West that they would overwhelm them. There's an argument behind that involving the work of an economist called, an engineer called Feldman, who misread Marx's theory of growth to some extent, arguing about producing the means of production and specialising in that and growing very rapidly. Made a bit of an error in his logic as it happens, but that was part of the vision they had, that they would overwhelm the production of the West. In fact, the East grew more slowly than the West. And Rihanna developed an argument about what he called resource-constrained versus demand-constrained economies. And he says that the neoclassical vision of capitalism is constrained by the conditions of supply. We have unlimited wants and scarce resources, and that's the vision of the neoclassicals have. The reality is capitalism is not constrained by inadequate supply, it's constrained by inadequate demand. And excess capacity is the rule. Rather than having unlimited wants and no capacity to cover it, you've actually got more capacity than you use. But rather than being like a critique of capitalism, which is the way the neoclassicals might interpret it, he didn't see that as waste at all, but a case of the byproduct of having opportunities, because there's all sorts of reasons why you want to have more capacity than you're actually going to use at any point in time. And the easiest one to get your head around is that in a growing economy, when you build a new factory, it must have more capacity available than you're going to use when you first turn it on. If you have to build a factory which is only big enough for the demand that you've got when you start it, you haven't built a big enough factory. You expect it to grow. So when you first build a new factory, you will have oodles of spare capacity. Secondly, because the future is uncertain, unlike the neoclassical vision of one you can rationally anticipate, you need excess capacity in case opportunities come up that you simply can't plan as to what they might be. And thirdly, because you have a system based on the attempt to accumulate wealth, and part of accumulating wealth is to pay as little as you can in wages, distributional effects will also limit effective demand anyway. Workers won't be able to buy all the output you wish to produce. So the main problem isn't that firms have to produce with diminishing marginal productivity, it's selling what they do produce given constrained effective demand. That's the real dilemma for them. And the empirical data supports Kornal quite simply. If you take a look at America and look not just at labour now, but look at capital, and so what happens to capacity utilisation over time, then you find, as well as the employment rate fluctuating, and you can see the trend there, the fall in the employment rate right up to the early 80s, back and falling rate again, but capacity changes even more than employment does. Quite a radical, that even at the maximum capacity, you don't get 90%. And when the slump hits, like back in the recession of the mid-1970s, capacity utilisation went from 90% to under 75%. So substantial cycles in capacity utilisation are never even approaching full utilisation of available capital. So the rule is excess capacity, not scarcity. And again, as I said, this is a strength of capitalism from Kornal's point of view, because it means that excess capacity exists because you're competing with other firms for the same market. There's a set amount in the market demand which you're all trying to capture as much as you can of. You therefore got excess capacity because you're all trying to compete for that limited demand, and that forces you to innovate. And therefore you get dynamic efficiency coming out of this rather than the static efficiency of neoclassical economics, where you produce the optimum amount. What you have from Kornal's point of view is a real emphasis upon trying to reduce your cost of production, improve your technology to attract customers to you rather than to your rivals. That's the essence of capitalism from Kornal's point of view. And therefore, what you get out of it is product innovation. Rather than having homogeneous products, which again is the neoclassical fixation of how we model capitalism, you have innovation going on all the time. How many different smartphones have we got in the room here? Who's got an Apple? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Who's got nothing other than an Apple? What have you got? Android? And Nokia? Yeah, and I've got a BlackBerry. Now, if we were all in Russia and asked you what phone you'd have, if this is talking back in the Soviet days, you wouldn't have had these anyway. They say it's for later before they turned up. You'd all have the same issue phone back at home. Okay? Innovation didn't work. I think I've told you the story about my first girlfriend's brother buying a motorbike. Have I told you that one? Okay. This is when I was about your age, or maybe younger even. My first girlfriend's brother wanted a 650cc motorbike, but he couldn't afford a Yamaha, which was the dominant bike at the time, which was at that stage was about $3,000 for a 650cc Yamaha or Honda motorbike. And he found he could buy a Russian one for $650, literally $1 per cc. And I was there when it got delivered. And this wooden crate turned up in the basement of their house. I mean, serious wooden crate with slats. You could see through the wood, and inside it was this greyish, brownish canvas. So we took pulled the wooden slats off the crate to open it up, pulled off the canvas, which happened to be oil impregnated. It was just oil reeking machine oil right the way through this thing. And underneath that was his motorbike. And what the motorbike actually was a 1942 BMW. Have you ever seen like an old Steve McQueen movie with Steve McQueen riding a motorbike in the Second World War? Okay, either stealing a boat from the Russians and a boat from the Germans and racing off to win World War II. Usual Steve McQueen movie. The motorbike he was on was a BMW with opposing cylinders, twin opposing cylinders, and the seat on the back was like a large woman's bicycle seat, like it's shaped like a large heart-like shape. That's what it was. It was 1942 BMW. The Russians had stolen the design in the Second World War, and that's what they were producing right up to and including this particular year, which is 1975. So the idea was if you wanted to produce more motorbikes in Russia, where you were actually supply constrained, the easiest way to do it was to reproduce last year's model. No innovation went on. If you did that in a European or an Asian context, with capitalism, you'd be wiped out by competitors. Yes, it may be cheaper, but it didn't have all the features the other bikes had. So the capitalist system gives you diversity, gives you change over time, technological innovation. The East didn't. So according to Kornal, the approach that neoclassicals take to modelling capitalism actually blinds them to the true strength the system has, and it forcefully identifies scarcity and efficiency as the main weaknesses of capitalism rather than insufficient aggregate demand. Now, nothing wrong with the demand being insufficient either in that sense. So there's good reasons to throw that whole argument out the window. And despite the fact that this research is done so well and empirically shows that the neoclassical model doesn't fit, they still stick with it. And the crazy thing is, neoclassical economists keep on, if they ever take a look at the data, rediscover the wheel all the time. The number of times it gets reinvented is simply unbelievable. With Blinder's work being the most recent example. So with his survey, what he actually did, he did improve on the surveys that were generally done. A lot of surveys were mail outs like the Eiteman and Guthrie things. Send a letter out to the manufacturer's representative, hope they'll reply for you. They actually got quite a good response rate, something like about 40 or 50%. But what Blinder did, so first of all, he hired PhD students to do it, so they knew the theory. Secondly, he arranged face-to-face interviews with these major firms. Okay? So he certainly it wasn't a case of some underling being asked to answer the question. They knew the rank of the person within the firm who was answering the questions. And they could tell whether they did or didn't know their own firm because the survey definitely did. And they also made sure that very unlikely that the manufacturer would misinterpret the question or not understand it. And the response he got back, which is mainly covered in chapter 4 of this book, was that 89% of them said, over 89% said that marginal costs either declined or stayed constant. And only 4 had the conventional arrangement you see in neoclassical models of elastic demand curves and increasing marginal costs. and fixed costs were far more important than the conventional theory says they are. And yet this research is ignored, yet again. Now, to give you an idea how badly it's being ignored, Blinder's book, as I said, was published in 1998. You know, Amazon lets people publish reviews of the books. There is one review of Alan Blinder's book. And guess who wrote it? Me. Okay? They don't read it. They don't. The book's been there. It's very good research. It should be a challenging thing for neoclassical theorists. They respond to the challenge by not reading it. The basic reason is the empirical literature is ignored. If they even know the empirical literature exists, they ignore it because it conflicts with their conventional theory. So here's some of the comparisons of the way the theory clashes with what Blinder found. How fast do prices adjust? Well, neoclassical theory argues it happens quickly. And in fact, even somebody who regards themselves as a progressive neoclassical like Krugman will argue that the reason we have crisis right now is prices don't adjust fast enough. They adjust quickly, but not fast enough. Now, if you have a new Keynesian argument, it's so fast you don't get anything out of equilibrium. They both model an equilibrium, so they think adjustments are that fast that there's no sales take place out of equilibrium. Blinder said, in fact, prices adjust slowly. 23% of firms will adjust after there's some change, 20% within a month, 26% take 1 to 3 months to adjust prices, 21% 4 to 6 months. This is after a major shock, by the way, saying, imagine there was a huge change to your demand. How long would it take you to change? Those are the sorts of results he got. And then talking about, in a typical year then, how often do you adjust prices? Well, said less than 2% of firms adjusted daily. RP data and Rismark are a bit of an exception on that front. 50% have changed their prices only once a year. So fully 50% of firms only made a change to their price levels once a year, which is extremely sluggish compared to the sort of theory you get out of equilibrium adjustments and stuff like that. That's taking a hell of a long time to react to obviously changing demand over that period of time. That's the full table over there. So what that means, therefore, is that most sales are going to be taking place out of equilibrium. Now, why don't they respond? Why don't they change prices more rapidly? These are some of the reasons firms gave. And one of the cause difficulties for our customers, 21% of firms gave that as a reason. 14% said because competition constrains them. 14% because there's multiple reasons. It's something for more than 100%. Actually, no, it does not go 100%. Those are the main reasons. Okay. Our costs don't change all that often. And then finally, some of the competition stuff. Most economists would have thought if they don't change prices rapidly because of collusion, like one of the main models in neoclassical theory that explains why prices don't change often was actually produced by a Marxist called Paul Sweezy as a joke, by the way, the idea of the kink demand curve. If anybody hasn't read the original paper by Sweezy, after going through the whole thing and saying if there was a price setter, so the price setter didn't move prices, so there'd be a kink in the demand curve at that point. He then pointed that would give you a kink in marginal revenue, discontinuity, and therefore you get more price stability. He finished that article by saying, I leave this idea for the interest of those, for the amusement of those who have more time with this stuff than I do. In other words, I think it's a load of nonsense, but here's a bit of fun I've had with your model. So, but anyway, neoclassicals, if they ask them why prices are sticky, they'd say price leadership, collusion, etc., etc. Look at where those sorts of things turn up here. Coordination via price scholarship, a minority compared to antagonising our customers. Now, neoclassical might think, why on earth would varying your prices, particularly going to reduce them, antagonise your customers? Well, they went into some of the reasons for that, and a lot of it is that neoclassical theory sees the relationship between firms and consumers as a very hands-off, anonymous relationship. David Graeber's work here is too, by the way, is quite worth reading on this whole idea about what is the actual nature of economic relationships through history. We're still seeing the same thing in capitalism today. So there's no buyer-seller relationship apart from the actual transaction in neoclassical theory. The only interest the consumer has is getting the lowest possible price. Whereas Blinder found that 85% of sales were to repeat customers. Now, for example, I was a very good repeat customer of Stratfield Car Radio. I will never return there again. because I got sold an absolute dud GPS system for those guys some time ago. And I know I've been set up for it now because it was 1.5 times as expensive as the one I replaced and an absolutely atrocious user interface. I'm never going to buy from there again. I'll buy from some other companies. So you don't want to antagonise you might get rid of the product, don't antagonise your reliable customers. Well, this is the result of most firms because 85% of their sales are to customers that had beforehand. They're trying to encourage you to come back. So, and as Blinder very sensibly summarised this, in the aggregate, sales to non-repeat customers, which is the usual neoclassical model, are almost small enough to be ignored. It's not the ones who want the lowest price you're after. It's the ones you have a long-term relationship with. The neoclassical theory focuses upon what actually is a minority. And 38% of GDP, this is a pretty huge figure, are sold under written contracts which fix the price. And there are no discounts. Again, one thing people thought there'd be discounts for bulk sales and stuff like that. No, most of these contracts are fixed price, and 70% of sales, this is the whole input-output nature of production. Again, neoclassical theory focuses on firms producing output to sell to consumers. This is direct linear relationship, there's no feedback going on there. But because you need to sell, you need to buy inputs from other firms to produce your own outputs, the input-output component of production absorbs 70% of total sales, only 1 in 5 sales that are actual end customers, the other 9% to government. So again, the nature of production is much more interactive than neoclassical theory puts across, and therefore you get infrequent price changes coming out of all that, because you don't want to disturb those continuing relationships. In fact, if you vary prices rapidly all the time, you're going to stuff up the accounting calculations of other firms. They don't appreciate that. So here's percentage made to different sectors by regular customers in different sectors. And like talking about the range of the median share that goes to repeat customers, for most of them, 85% of sales are repeat customers. Manufacturing is almost 92%. Even for retail trade, it's still 71% repeat customers. So if you had regular up and down price movements, what that would do is antagonise consumers in planning their budgets. You can handle a bit of that, certainly do on the retail level, but you don't want to repeat for your wholesale customers. It disturbs the calculations of other firms who make up 70% or more of all your sales. That's the real reason. And another neoclassical thing, what do firms worry about? Nominal profits or real profits? Well, economic theory ignores monetary issues. Of course, I'm going to be going heavily into that in future lectures. And therefore, you should be able to be aiming to get the best real returns you can. Blinded result, 50% of firms never consider inflation when setting their own prices. So rather than prices affecting what you expect inflation to be, and that's part of the whole neoclassical vision of how prices are set, less than 1/3 worry about the expected rate of inflation. And again, Blinder was very good at summarising the results very realistically, saying the responses hold bad news for any theory based on the idea that firms seek to set their real price. Demand elasticity. Well, neoclassical theory says that elasticity demand is really, really important. One of the few interesting empirical calculations you might do in an undergraduate degree is being given data and told to calculate elasticity of demand. And if most industries are competitive, then according to theory, that elasticity should be high. And here we go. Not only do firms not have an estimate of elasticity handy, so people who could afford to pay for it to be done don't bother doing it, they're only accustomed to thinking that way. And 40% of firms said elasticity was 0. They changed they cut their prices by 10%, and it have no impact on their sales. Now clearly that will vary in different industries. If you look at retail and imagine that might have an impact. But 70% said it's below 1. Only 2.5% of firms gave a high estimate for elasticity, and therefore for most firms, dropping their price wasn't going to increase their sales volume. And finally, again, I want to be punchline, only 1/6 of GDP is sold in the conditions of elastic demand. Most are sold in the conditions of inelastic demand. And he says, again, go back to the points you learned in your neoclassical micro, only firms with price elasticity greater than unity can increase total revenue by cutting prices. And what does that mean? Well, if you have an elastic demand curve, then you're fairly likely to compete on price. In the inelastic demand curve, competing on price is going to cut into your revenue. And the idea goes like this. There's your elastic demand curve, and therefore if you have a small change in fall in price, there's a large change in revenue. The box gets bigger. But if you have a very steep demand curve, then a small change in price can cause a large fall in revenue. So you don't have much encouragement to drop your price. And again, those are the percentages that he found in terms of those who said they had a high but a very low level of elasticity, and most have a very low level of elasticity. Again, very different from the theory. Fixed costs. Well, one thing you get taught in neoclassical theory is ignore them because they're sunk costs. Todd, you've already incurred them. No point worrying about those. Variable costs are going to determine your scale of output. And fixed costs are normally drawn as being quite small, otherwise you wouldn't get rising average costs coming out. Even if you've seen rising marginal costs, you would have falling average costs because the fixed costs would be amortized if they're very large over a rising number of units. What he found was fixed costs are important. Look at this. In the fair number of cases, and this was the big surprise, fixed variable had no natural meaning, that it didn't think that way. Once the concept was explained to them, fully half their costs came out as fixed. Virtually half their costs, it was a pretty even division between the two. Rather than fixed costs being fairly irrelevant and variable costs the dominant factor, they both were important, and they certainly had fixed costs being more important than neoclassical theory argued. Now, take a good look at your economics textbooks and try to find an example. And the examples you'll find is stuff like this garbage from Mankiw, involving a lemonade stand, where you've got low fixed costs being a low percentage of average costs, and therefore you get the rising marginal costs coming out of the assumptions they make. The reason being, they do this sort of stuff because they can't find any examples of their theories from Mankiw. Here we have the number of units of lemonade made. Bagels per hour. How ethnic. Bagels, better than lemonade, I suppose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 14 bagels per hour. What size factory produces 14 bagels an hour, for God's sake? Okay. 14,000 bagels maybe, but not 14. And then down here, quantity of bagel per hour again, showing rising marginal cost. You actually get minimum marginal cost at 4 bagels an hour. Bloody hell, I can make that many. And then the numbers over here, this is the Thelma's Lemonade Shop. I don't think it's Louisiana, by the way. Nonsense, bloody example. It's typical textbook stuff. And the reason you won't see any real examples is you can't find any that fit the theory. They have to work really, really hard to get anything that even looks vaguely like the theory seems the real world is. So fixed costs aren't irrelevant, because for a start they're much higher, and the scale of fixed costs, to give you an idea of some of them, I've lost track of what the cost of a new semiconductor plant is now, but the semiconductors are part of machines like this have incredibly refined air levels, very, very finely controlled voltages, extremely expensive technology, and to build a new plant, you're looking at an investment, so back in the early 2000s, of well over $1 billion. You're not going to ignore $1 billion. And they're a much larger proportion of total average costs overall. And that's again what Blinder found in doing this survey. So again, the mean level was that 43% of costs were fixed. A far higher proportion than the economic theory would have you expect. And rising marginal costs, well, of course they do, don't they? Otherwise, competitive firms will produce infinite amounts, therefore they must rise because firms are competitive, blah, blah, blah. And you couldn't work out a profit level, profit maximizing level. Blinded results, again, this is the common theme through so many research papers. Only a minority of firms reported rising marginal costs, and almost half reported falling marginal costs for Blinder. Half said 41% had falling marginal costs, 48% constant marginal costs. Only the remainder, 11%, said they had rising marginal costs. And again, give Blinder great credit for honestly stating these results. The overwhelmingly bad news here for economic theory is that apparently only 11% of GDP is produced on the rising marginal cost. Now, that's what he drew. I'd never accuse him of being an artist. That's what he drew, obviously virtually typing it out. Heaven knows why the publisher let him get away with those diagrams. But he showed 4 different patterns, or 5 different patterns that firms had. The first is the 32.6 reporting decreasing marginal cost, 40.5 being constant, and the 7.9 said there's going to be discrete jumps on there, obviously make a transition from one factory to another, and whether that's constant marginal cost or falling marginal cost. So you need this whole idea of downward sloping marginal costs to give you a supply curve. Pardon me, upwards. But his problem, of course, is if you have downward sloping marginal costs, then you should get downward sloping supply curves as well. And that causes an increase in demand. Therefore, an increase in demand causes price to fall, which is the opposite of what theory argues. Of course, that's good for consumers, but it's bad for economic theory because what you get is a situation like that. Now, as demand moves out, price is going to fall. And in fact, you can, in many ways, see that if you look at what happens to the cost of things like iPads and so on. The more units are produced in a dynamic sense, rather than the static version of neoclassical theory, the cheaper they get. We don't face rising costs because of that, we get falling prices. So that screws the argument that neoclassical theory makes about prices setting relative scarcity. Because if that was the case, if demand rises and scarcity therefore rises, therefore relative price should rise. But what Blinder found empirically was that if the rise in demand means a fall in price, you don't get price signals doing what economists think prices do, and therefore it blows the theory out of the water. So maybe prices don't reflect relative scarcity at all. Maybe there are other factors that matter there, like the rate of growth of demand, which neoclassical leave out, that play the role that economists think prices actually play. And if you think about things like computers and MP3 players or MP4 players now, rising demand and falling price, it doesn't make the products less profitable to produce by any stretch of imagination. Now, back to, again, the role that prices play in its equilibrating mechanism. If you have shifting supply and demand, which neoclassical theory says we face as a rule all the time, that will cause fluctuating prices. But Blinder said, no, that won't happen, because one thing, we expect to have prices rising in burns and falling during slumps, because we have this idea of an upward sloping supply curve. But it's quite possible that if supply actually drops, then you might get relative prices moving counter-cyclically. Now, one interesting thing, Blinder didn't dot the I's here, but one paper that I have a lot of time for is the Kidlin and Prescott paper, I think from 1990, called Real Facts and a Monetary Myth, talking about the business cycle. And one empirical data they found was that prices were weren't cyclical. Pardon me. So they had, rather than pro-cyclical prices rising during burns and falling during slumps. Kidlin and Prescott found what Blinder's reporting here for individual firms, that you've got counter-cyclical price movements. Okay? A boom occurs, prices fell. And stocks, what happened about stocks? Pardon me, another error here in putting my slides together. Well, economic theory doesn't worry about stocks because all markets are spot markets. All sales occur, whatever you dump on the market gets sold, nothing left over, there's no stocks, no buffer. Blinder found out, on the other hand, that people produce and sell to, produce first of all the stock. They have stocks and they produce to replenish the stocks before they get depleted. And even wholesale and retail primarily sell from stocks. So stocks are actually the buffer. Rather than prices playing the equilibrating mechanism between supply and demand, it's the buffer of unsold stocks. So if you have a bunch of cars sitting in your car yard and you don't sell them all on Tuesday, the ones you don't sell are there for sale on Wednesday. Okay? You don't have to drop the price and make sure you flog them all by Tuesday. That's not how sales work. And how relevant is economic theory? Well, of course, neoclassical would like to say it's vital. Blinder, forget it. Said rising marginal cost doesn't apply. Fixed costs are much more important, etc., etc. And he said he actually wondered whether maybe they didn't understand us. We didn't explain ourselves where we in that necessarily had PhD students doing the explaining, and you had managers of firms answering the questions. If you couldn't get sensible answers out of that, where people actually understood what they were being asked, you're in trouble. You said it paints a picture image of the cost structure of a typical firm that is very different from the one modelized in textbooks. So what we find is a whole lot of ways in which the empirical facts of the firm conflict with neoclassical theory. I won't try to go through this one in great detail here. That's one for you to take a look at the slides later. But the basic things like infrequent price adjustments versus the argument that they're frequent ones. Fixed price contracts are common versus the idea of spot prices all the time. Most sales are to other businesses, not to utility maximising consumers. So there's different consideration depending on what they think about prices. Fixed costs are very important. Marginal costs fall. The theory is out the window. And the theory is actually, rather than explaining reality, it's ignoring reality. So they hang on to prior beliefs it has about what happens in supply and demand. And this is typical of neoclassical theory once more. You've got a false ideology of methodology now turning up saying assumptions don't matter. And what neoclassical economists mean by that is, don't attack our assumptions. They don't mean make any assumptions you like, because I have a nice record of papers rejected from neoclassical journal because I wouldn't make neoclassical assumptions. What they're saying is don't criticise our assumptions, including these assumptions, which are counterfactual ones. And if you look back at Friedman, which is where this famous ridiculous paper on methodology came from, saying assumptions don't matter, his actual target was say, don't read these papers being published right now in these journals telling you what firms do. He says, because the listeners might well tell you something like this, it's not a testable hypothesis. Ignore it. Now, unfortunately, because what firms are saying is the opposite of what theorists assume about the nature of firms, and the people running the firms know more about it than the theorists do, rather than making counterfactual assumptions, maybe we should actually model what they do. And that's important to say, just in case assumptions don't matter. You make any assumptions you like, etc., etc. You're making assumptions which are contrary to the facts. And then believing you can build a realistic theory, a theory which actually describes capitalism efficiently, effectively, by making counterfactual assumptions about the real world. Now, I think that's nonsense. And there's maybe time for another break, but you're about to get ahead with some really heavy stuff on our matrix mathematics now. So another short break, and let's come back in about, say, because I've talked so far about the Walrasian model in the first couple of lectures, effectively. What I'm now going to look at is to ignore the flaws in the Marshallian model, look at what happens when you try to coordinate all markets together. I've done some of that, of course, with the Sonnenschein mandrel de Boer conditions. But if clearly, if you're going to have general equilibrium, which is one of the believed foundations of neoclassical theory, then you might achieve equilibrium in one market, only have a disturb by disequilibrium in another. So one important question to do equilibrium analysis, which is such a fixation in neoclassical theory, is to work out the conditions that give you equilibrium in all markets. And the first person to try that was Leon Walras, and see his importance in neoclassical theory, and in fact they call it Walrasian economics. And of course, as I've shown you at the beginning of this lecture, you've got all sorts of dynamics involved in producing commodities in a single world, in the modern world. Now, Walras ignored all that initially to focus on a pure exchange model. So it's like a huge auction room where you all come along with all the commodities you've got that you want to sell, and all the commodities you want to buy are also in the same room. And you simply want to exchange the commodities you've got that are going to be surplus given a particular price versus others you want to have given whatever price the market ultimately sets for those commodities. Now, Walras realised that if we didn't want to have the distribution of income or wealth affected by out of equilibrium trades, he wanted everything to happen in equilibrium. And it'd be quite possible if you had out of equilibrium trade, some people would receive too much for what they sold, others too little. So you're trying to avoid that disequilibrium effect. And he said certainly if you had non-equilibrium trades, there'd be no chance of it ever converging. So he invented a fiction to get around that problem. And the fiction was the Walrasian auctioneer. The idea that even though there may be people who are quite willing to buy or sell a particular commodity at a particular price, They weren't allowed to trade until everybody was happy with the prices applying in every market. And therefore you had an equality of size, so buyers and sellers in every last market, and everything was a spot transaction. There were nobody'd walk out of the room with any goods they wanted to sell and weren't able to get a buyer for. Everything would be sold. So this was your costless auctioneer. Now anybody who knows thermodynamics knows this is a bit like having Maxwell's demon running the system. Economists are happy to assume the existence of Maxwell's demon, calling the Walrasian auctioneer. And here's how Walras put it. Let us imagine, thank God he used the word imagine, okay? Quite sensible. A market in which only consumers, goods and services are bought and sold, so there's no production purchases going on. And he says once these prices are cried at random, there's a random set of prices are first of all set. Everybody works out, given this randomly chosen initial vector for prices, which ones they've got too much of, which ones they've got too little. And they then say, oh, I want to sell X units of one good and Y units of another. And you tell up all the amounts people want to sell. And for some, there are people trying to sell more than there are buyers at that particular price. Others, there are less buyers than sellers. So then the auctioneer says, well, I'm going to increase the prices of those goods where there weren't enough sellers and decrease the prices of the others where there are too many sellers, and to get a new set of prices. And keep on going, it says, and prices will rise or fall until demand and the offer of each good and each service are equal. And only when demand was coordinated in every last market, so demand in each market equals supply in each market, then prices will be equilibrium prices, and then you'll exchange take place. And that's the mechanism he thought that mechanism would actually achieve equilibrium prices. And now it's a dynamic process because each process is a time step, so you have a sequence of events. But it's out of time because you don't allow anything to happen until that moment where all prices are in equilibrium. So it's dynamic, but it's outside time in that sense. So you have the auctioneer making an initial guess. The prices then determine the wealth, because price times the quantity of all the goods you've got gives you your initial wealth. It determines the supplies, which is the gap between the stocks you hang on to for consumption and what you actually want to sell. The demand you have, and then each agent has a balance. Each agent looking at the price multiplied by what they're going to supply is going to be equal to the price times what they're going to demand. Everybody's going to be in equilibrium individually, or attempt to be. And then only once all markets are in equilibrium trade occurs, otherwise you adjust the prices. So you increase the prices where demand is greater than supply. Recalculate, keep on going until reach equilibrium, then you allow trade. That's the mechanism. Now, will that process actually converge? Well, Walras thought the answer was yes. But, of course, if you change prices in one market, then you affect what's going to happen in all the others as well. There's a feedback effect. And the feedback effects could overwhelm the direct effects. And Walras thought, well, that's possible. But he said, well, the direct effects are always going to be in the correct direction. If you have demand being greater than supply, then if you push prices up, you're going to reduce demand. Exactly what the effect you want to have. Whereas the indirect effects are going to be in all sorts of directions. Maybe prices will go up, maybe prices go down. They could cancel each other out. This is how he put it. He said it will appear probable. Again, he's using the correct wording here. That if we make changes in one direction which reduce an inequality to an equality, that invariably is in the direction you want prices to go, towards equilibrium in that particular market. He said, but the consequences that has for other markets will be sometimes up, sometimes down. And so at a certain point they cancel each other out. He said, therefore your new vector is likely to be closer to the equilibrium than the old vector. If you keep on going, you'll finally converge on equilibrium. Now, Walras actually tried to get the leading mathematician at the time, Henri Poincaré, to confirm his belief. And Poincaré declined. Poincaré thought it was too complicated to answer the question. He wasn't sure that Walras' hypothesis was right. But he thought that was correct, and he then thought you could generalise it to production and then ultimately even out of equilibrium exchange. But he didn't even get to first base. Because when it was done at a detailed level of mathematics, and you're seeing it quoted from 1986 now, he said from static analysis, going back to Walras and Marshall, it is known that even under very plausible circumstances, there are multiple equilibria. As I showed you, this part of the Saint-Germain-Gerbert conditions applying there. So you can't get equilibrium even with atonement. But it's more complicated than that. And I'll show you the complications in a moment. So the way that Neoclassical should have reacted to that is to say, oh well, the equilibrium exchange can't occur. Therefore you need disequilibrium prices. Sensible reaction. No. It's natural to conclude that the possible absence of global stability calls for replacing the Waller's entertainment process with another one that achieves equilibrium. And what he suggested doing was adjusting people's demand functions. So Lara, you don't really feel like that cup of coffee, I'm going to take it away from you to change the demand for coffee. That's okay, isn't it? I mean, you read this stuff and you think, you know, what are you smoking? Yeah. Pardon? So I said, clearly the informational burden is greater than for Volrag. You've got to know what people want and how to change their minds. Bullshit, shoot the door. One is generally prepared to require a bigger message space when stability is demanded. Who demands it, apart from our neoclassical economists? Stability is not required. So there's bullshit galore through this theory. You've already got this fiction that you're leaving out of equilibrium trades, productions, and so on. Now, if that can't reach equilibrium, then what on earth is going to? So we should have gone across to disequilibrium thinking even then. But that's not what neoclassical theory did. It tried to find more and more unrealistic ways, because they were the only ways you could find, of reaching equilibrium. And the Arrow-de-Breu model was the absolute pinnacle of it. Because de Breu, in 1950, he got the Nobel Prize for this thing. I think he should have been given a white coat for it. But he had a remarkable instantaneous market theory where all producers and consumers know the future. When they make a decision, it's for all time. They may decide now what they're going to consume forever. Every other cup of coffee will ever purchase and what date they'll buy it on. And he generalised the so-called uncertain events by making past mistakes reversible via insurance markets. So you could buy an umbrella for rain tonight, but since it's not raining, you don't take the umbrella. You never waste any money. You can always reverse mistakes. And it's just priceless. This is actually a quote out of de Breu. For any economic agent, a complete action plan, brackets, made now for the whole future, is a specification of each commodity and the quantity he'll buy at every moment in time for the entire future. A production plan made now for the whole future is a specification of all the inputs and all the outputs. Now it gets better. I love this bit. The certainty assumption implies that he knows what input-output combinations will be possible in the future. So somebody today works out the amount of hydrogen going to require in future for that helium reactor he's going to have in 2035, even though he doesn't know how a helium reactor works. And he said the role of a producer or consumer is to make a consumption plan. Role is to choose and carry out a consumption plan made now for the whole future. A Nobel Prize? The declaration of insanity is closer to it. And then we get to uncertainty, and this is just priceless. It extends the analysis to include uncertain events. And the way you do it is by having a contract. You replace all, I'll have that cup of coffee, thank you. You buy an insurance contract for a delivery of a cup of coffee at 3 o'clock in the morning if you want to stay awake. But if you don't want to stay awake, you don't take delivery of the cup of coffee. Contingent contracts. And this punchline here is just, why anybody even, how students have sat through this stuff, you should have pointed the degree of mind-numbing that goes on to follow neoclassical theory. This new definition of a commodity allows one to obtain a theory of uncertainty, free of any probability concept, and formally identical with the theory of certainty developed in the preceding chapters. And this is what they call Arrow-de-Breu general equilibrium. It's total crap, total bull crap. Let's shoot the damn cow, move on a bit further. And this is how physicists react to it when they see this sort of stuff. There's a guy called Joe Macaulay. And he says, here's what's going on. He said, at time t equals 0, you plan your entire future. You ought to occur on a current future date. You need to pay for your children's education, kids you have to hack it, of course. Buy your vacation house, buy all your drugs, etc., etc. Everything is planned for the entire future at time t equals 0. He said that was necessary to build the theorem where these models actually worked. And Macaulay summed it beautifully. Theorem proving in a totally unrealistic market became more important than the empirics of real-world markets. That's neoclassical theory. Now, why the unrealistic assumptions? Because, as it turns out, any slightly more realistic model is provably unstable. And I'm afraid I'm going to do a bit of mathematics here, so brace yourselves. But the main intuition I want to get through in this case is that stability of outputs and stability of prices are incompatible. If you want to have equilibrium quantities, you can't also have equilibrium prices as a dynamic process. So, now most economists believe that general equilibrium is stable, but this will actually show that you can't have a stable multi-market system without stocks and without prices and so on. And there's a huge literature on the whole area with all sorts of garbage in there, as well as bloopers like typical neoclassical stuff. The best exposition comes out of Blatt's book, Dynamic Economic Systems, a post-Keynesian approach. Blatt being a professor of applied mathematics. And he says, let's consider a simple market clearing economy where you've got fixed inputs producing fixed outputs, so the onti of production technology. So none of this stuff like this stuff. It's a certain number of inputs, certain number of outputs. And he has perfect thrift. So what he's doing is saying all the consumption is embedded in the input-output coefficients. So you include the food needed to keep the workers alive in your input-output coefficients. He leaves out credit for technological change, etc., and he still shows the system is unstable. So you can actually describe the entire system here by an input-output matrix. And the matrix A has elements Aij, where it's the quantity of the jth commodity. Aij is the quantity of the jth commodity needed to produce 1 unit of the ith commodity. It's hard to read. It does take a while to get you through it. But imagine there's 2 commodities here, corn and iron, and it takes 9/10 of a quarter of corn and 1/20 of a ton of iron to make 1/4 of corn. I should have bushel there. And say 3/5 of a bushel of corn and 1/5 of a ton of iron to produce 1 ton of iron. Those are your input coefficients to produce that output. Now that's the way you summarise it. There's your 9/10 and 1/20 on the first row, and 3/5 and 1/5 on the second row of that matrix. Okay? Stage 1. Now, you can then, if you then transpose that matrix, that tells you what production is completely, because the corn inputs in year 1 are going to be 9/10 of the corn output you need in year 2, and 3/5 of the iron output you need in year 2 as well, the inputs at that stage. And the iron inputs in year 1 will be 1/20 of the corn output you need in year 2, and 1/5 of the iron output you need in year 2, given those input-output coefficients. So there's your expressions of the amount of corn in year T and iron in year T will be this matrix, which is a transpose of the previous one, multiplied by your level of output of corn in year T plus 1 and your iron in year T plus 1. That matrix is now the transpose. Part of the S is a mistake there. I would have, in editing that, trying to change the font from Comic Sans, where everybody seems to hate, across to something people like. I must have, when I went to type Control S, I typed S instead. This is going to bring up the editing window for me. Oh dear. Not going to do it. Oh, here we go. Good. Okay. I'll get on well on YouTube. Okay. Now for balanced growth, we're going to have growth that's happening in the economy over time. Then both commodities have to grow at the same rate. So you can then say that, as well as having this matrix expression defined, there's a relationship between corn at time t and corn at time t plus 1. You can also say that your corn at time t plus 1 and iron at time t plus 1 are going to be alpha times corn at time t and iron at time t, where alpha is greater than 1. Okay? The gap between the alpha and 1 is going to be your growth rate. You rearrange those equations, the matrix equation. I'm shuffling around terms now. To do that, I've got to use matrix mathematics where I multiply things in a particular sequence. We're all used to matrix mathematics in that way. Okay, so I'm pre-multiplying by AT to the minus 1 to get this expression now in terms of corn at time t being some function of corn at time t minus 1. So the system for balanced growth is that corn at time t plus 1 and iron at time t plus 1 have to be the inverse matrix of the transpose of A times the inputs outputs time t and time corn and iron, and therefore also equal to alpha times those inputs for balanced growth. So the matrix of which conditions have to be the same as a scalar multiple of that vector. So you solve for the growth factor A, or it should be alpha there, pardon me, rather than A. There's going to be your solution, again using matrix mathematics to just summarize them two together. This whole expression has to be somehow equivalent to the vector 0. And so for the example economy, all that expression there, 20 over 3 times all this, well now, this is now a quadratic equation. Okay? When you expand the matrix, you're going to get a determinant out of it, and that's going to be a quadratic equation which you're going to have minus alpha, these two expressions on the diagonal, multiplied together, you're going to get a quadratic and alpha, and you get the determinant. So that comes out as being that quadratic. So the solution, the roots of that quadratic will tell you the values to which that expression is effectively the same as 0. And you get two values for it, a very large eigenvalue, a root of 6.27, and a smaller one of 1.06. Now you might guess that 1.06 looks like a growth rate of 6% per annum, and that's pretty much the figure that Blatt's working with here. But the first value that came out there isn't economically meaningful because to actually get that to work, the root of the equation is where you get a negative ratio of corn output to iron output, you've got to have positive of both. So you rule out the negative root, or rather the root that gives you a negative ratio, you've got to have one where you get a positive ratio of corn to iron. That's the meaning for what's known as eigenvalue. I'll talk about that in a moment. There's your annual growth rate of 6.35%, 325%. And that gives you, that then tells you as well your ratio of corn to iron. Units of corn, which are measured in bushels, to other units of iron measured in tonnes, will be 14.8 bushels of corn produced in this economy per tonne of iron. And that'll give you balanced growth. So your balanced growth rate is 6.325% growth per annum in both corn and iron, with a ratio of 14.8, I'll make that bushels rather than quarters for later reference, bushels of corn per tonne of iron. And what that looks like, there's your corn output and there's your iron output on the balanced growth path, given a particular set of initial conditions which will both also fit that level. So you can have balanced growth if the initial conditions are correct. We've got that ratio between corn output in year 0 and iron output in year 0 is that 14.11 ratio. But what if you've got a slightly different value? What if you have, say, corn output 0.1% higher in year 0 than that perfect ratio? This is what happens. Corn output bounces up, suddenly deviates above, iron output goes negative, which is crazy. You can't get negative output. What's happening? Something weird's happened there. In year 6, negative iron output. What about the spot prices? Can you be stabilised by spot prices? Well, let's take a look at the market clearing now. And for market clearing, you must have the price ratio of corn to iron. It means that the value of the corn you supply to the market equals the value of the iron supplied to the market. There's a gap because there's input-output going on here. The amount you supply is different than the amount you're going to produce, because some of what you produce is going to be consumed to use making the iron and the corn itself. So the corn output minus the proportion of corn you hang on to produce corn is the supply. And the iron output minus the iron you hang on to produce iron is the iron supply. It's a gap between what's produced and what's supplied to the market. And these are the supply to market equations. So the supply to market is the production minus the matrix multiplied by the output you want to have in the next year. And again, summarising this all down using matrix transposes and so on, what you get is this expression. I'm going to erase this because I'm going to get more of the logic behind you in a moment, just to give you an empirical example of how it all works. When you're working along, you finally find that you need this spot market equilibrium to apply. So you need a market clearing ratio between the two that gives you that ratio being correct. And there's the market ratio, the price of time t of corn to iron. And there's your equilibrium coming out of the whole thing. Equilibrium prices are fine. If you start with equilibrium initial conditions, they both grow smoothly. And notice also that the supply of corn to market is much less than the output because so much corn is used in making corn. But if you start with disequilibrium initial conditions, that's what happens to your prices. They go negative too. The price of corn rises despite the fact you've got an excess supply of corn. You get perverse behaviour coming out of this. And that's because the quantity market also behaves perversely. Even though the quantity of corn supplied is lower than equilibrium, but it's lower, supply is lower than equilibrium, even though outputs are higher, again because of those input-output effects. So what economists say, well, that's all due to this craziness of seemingly obvious technology. We're much better than that. We have this flexible idea of things like rather than linear relationship you get out of a matrix. We're really clever. We use non-linear stuff like Cobb-Douglas. Well, I've already shown you what Cobb-Douglas actually means. But again, they're misunderstanding the whole meaning of this analysis because, as it happens, the linear component of, you can take any non-linear function like, for example, Cobb-Douglas, even though I've shown it to be nonsense, and you can break it down into a quadratic equation of a constant plus another, plus a constant value plus a set of scalars multiplied by the x value plus another set by the x squared value and so on. And the section, the part that dominates this behaviour is actually the linear bit. So if a linear model can't converge, neither can a non-linear one. And in fact what's going on is this is a necessary result of any input-output matrix that allows growth to occur. And this is the stuff that Vollrath didn't know when he wrote his stuff on general equilibrium, but which was found out much, much later by mathematicians simply looking at the property of matrices. So let's just take a look now algebraically. It'll be easier to follow the numerical example I've just given you. And say you've got a simplest possible world where there's n markets. You produce input-output using, the commodity producing input-output system. You have spot prices, and all output in year t becomes an input for year t plus 1. So the same idea, everything is internally consumed. Then the economy is growing over time, so you can say for equilibrium, what you produce as an output in year 0 has to be sufficient for what your production needs are in year 1, and on you go through time. And prices have to enable producers to buy their inputs. So what they sell their output for must let them buy the inputs the year after. And you can put that up in a matrix equation, which is this simple equation here, saying the outputs of doing an output-input transformation, the outputs in year t plus 1 are going to be a matrix times the inputs in year t. There's the output in 2005, which is a vector. There's a production process which is derived from a productive input-output technology, meaning you actually produce a physical surplus. You're not going backwards every year. And that's outputs in year 2004 are inputs for year 2005. That's the basic equation. Now, if you're going to have stable growth, again, the same idea, each sector has to grow at the same rate. So I can then say, as well as that being true in a matrix sense, this equation with a scalar involved, 1 plus alpha, must also be true. And there's 2005 outputs of socks, DVD players, MP3s, etc., has to be alpha percent greater than the output the year beforehand. Now you can combine these together. Again, this is going to be easier, I think, than the numerical example to show you that it actually did mean something when you try to do a simulation of it. That has to equal the growth condition. So now you have, equating the two, you've got the matrix A times x at t has to be equal 1 plus alpha times x at t. So again, you rearrange using matrix rules. You subtract from one side or the other. You then multiply through by the identity matrix to convert 1 plus alpha into a matrix. And therefore, that bit, A minus 1 plus alpha times the identity matrix, has to be somehow equivalent to 0 for that equation to be feasible. So that expression is similar to 0, but its determinant is equal to 0. And the price condition now we'll take a look at, you can also put that down in a matrix expression. So prices have to enable producers to buy their inputs. And relative prices have to be constant. Now, that's the condition, different condition to quantities now. So your cost of inputs is P, which is a list of prices, so one price per commodity, times the outputs you produce using the inputs, times the equilibrium rate of profit. You've got to be making a profit out of this, which is uniform across the entire economy. So you can now express that as your equation for prices being in equilibrium as well. So there's your list of prices, a vector, and it's on both sides of the equation. There's your uniform rate of profit, and there's the table of the outputs that are produced from inputs. So rearrange those using matrix rules, and of course here's where the order of multiplication matters because of the fact that the matrix times P times I than I times P. You've got a different structure entirely. So multiply by the inverse of A, so we'll multiply by both sides, post multiply by A to the minus 1. And now what I get is P times A to the minus 1 has to equal to P times 1 plus alpha, P being the price vector, times 1 plus rate of profit pi times I. Subtract that from the left-hand side, group on the P's, and I've now got a new expression which also has to be equivalent to a 0 in some sense. So A to the minus 1 minus 1 plus pi times I has to be equal to 0 in a similar sense. And now we come to one of the properties of matrices, things called eigenvalues and eigenvectors, German for principal value and principal vector, principal direction. And effectively what they are is the eigenvalues are the zeros of a polynomial you can derive from the matrix. So you have one root, for example, y equals a plus bx, 2 for which you get out of a scalar equation, 2 for a 2 by 2 matrix, etc., etc. And if you're going to have a stable system, the biggest root has to be less than 1. Now here's a problem. A and a minus 1 have inverse roots. So if a, for example, has a root of 1/2, then a to the minus 1 has a principal root of 2. Now, that's a real problem if it actually happens. But it'd be okay if they were both negative, because if the root of 1 was minus 1/2, then the root of the other would be minus 2, and they're both less than 1. Not a problem. So you really, if you're a neoclassical economist, want these eigenvalues to have, want the dominant eigenvalues, it's called, of these matrices to be negative. And that's where you've got to go out and shoot every mathematician on the planet, because they all know a thing called the Ferron-Frobenius theorem. And that applies to the nature of a matrix consisting of all either zeros or positive entries. Very complex thesis. Don Blatt described it in his book, The Non-Trivial Theorem. That means serious mathematical work was needed to derive this thesis. And that said that if you have a matrix consisting of either zeros or positive numbers, the dominant eigenvalue of that matrix will be greater than 0. And mathematicians didn't do that to be nasty to economists. Just working out the property of a particular matrix, a very important theorem in mathematics. And it matters to economics because you can't use a negative amount of some commodity to produce something. You've got to have positive quantities of all inputs to produce these outputs. So A or a to the minus 1 of them must have a root greater than 1. Because if one of them has a maximum root of 0.01, the other will have a maximum root of 100. So therefore, either prices or quantities must be unstable. It's called in economics literature the dual stability problem. It's actually more honestly the dual instability problem. And what that means is if you have a system based on the properties of this matrix, where it needs both the matrix and its inverse to converge, describe dynamic processes and converge to one commodity, the other prices, one or the other is going to diverge. So if you can start in equilibrium, you can stay there. But if you move even slightly away from equilibrium, the dynamic process will move you further away still. So therefore, general equilibrium will never be in equilibrium unless it starts there and never moves. It's not describing a situation of equilibrium at all. Now, intuitively what's going on here is that Volra hoped that direct effects, the stuff that applies along the diagonal of the matrix effectively, would overwhelm what happened off the matrix. In fact, that wasn't the case. The indirect effects, the stuff that's off the matrix, actually dominates that on the primary axis. So you therefore get an unstable system. Your equilibrium will not converge when you've got production involved, something that wasn't been looked at by Volra's determinant model. Now, Neoclassical reckon this in lots of ways. One is they'll say that it's just an artifact of matrix. It doesn't actually describe real production. We've got this, sophisticated nonlinear stuff like the Cobb-Douglas production function. Or let's find ways to make it stable, or let's ignore stability entirely. Now, on the first one, yes, input output table is strictly linear. You've got rich proportions between inputs and outputs. That's a linear relationship. And the neoclassical models can be nonlinear because of marginal, diminishing marginal productivity. Can we say that the Cobb-Douglas production function? So yes, neoclassical models will be stable where IO ones are not. No, they won't. Because again, a matrix S is linear, which is a bit like the B in the A, Y, the X equals A times B times X. And neoclassical functions like the Cobb-Douglas have to be expressed using a polynomial expansion that goes beyond A plus B times X. But any nonlinear function can be approximated by a polynomial. For example, this is sine x. Sine x can be approximated by x minus 1/6 x cubed plus 1/20 x fifth minus 1/5000 x seventh, etc., etc. But the part that dominates this behaviour close to equilibrium is just the linear bit, which is y is equal to x. The linear bit is x, and that is very close to sine x when you're very close to 0. The other terms don't matter. So the equilibrium bit, the part that happens around equilibrium, is just the linear bit. So if the linear bit's unstable, the nonlinear stuff won't save the stability. It might stop you having crazy results further away from equilibrium. But stability near the equilibrium is determined just by the linear bit. So the closer you get to equilibrium, to the equilibrium point itself, the more the linear stuff dominates. If the linear stuff's unstable, you're going to have an unstable system. So the nonlinear stuff doesn't save you. It stops you getting ridiculous stuff further away. But here's like just showing the approximation of sine of x to a straight line to the sine of x. And when you're really close to 0, it's a perfectly accurate approximation. It's only when you move further away when you start getting a difference between that linear approximation and the actual system. The same for stability. So you might, with a nonlinear function, stop disequilibrium prices becoming negative, but you won't make the equilibrium stable. And therefore multiple supply and demand markets can't all be in equilibrium unless you start there and you never get disturbed. And that takes to the second bit. Let's find ways of making it stable. Well, Jorgensen was the first person to realise this instability problem in economic literature. And he pointed out this whole thing that if the upward system is relatively stable, then prices can't be and vice versa, back in 1960. But he then said, therefore, we have to conclude that excess capacity is necessary, which is not a silly way of working it out. That's quite a reasonable approximation. Therefore, you need buffers. You can't have spot markets. Sensible conclusion from that result. But then he says, his neoclassical genes take over. To avoid dual instability, a number of reinterpretations have been proposed. Here's another one. So he brags in the changing behaviour of decision makers. You can't have a cup of coffee, you don't like it anymore, trust me. Changing people's behaviour. But he then brings in things like restricting initial values. So you change where the economy starts from. Going back in history, of course, which is simple. Just grab yourself your nearest copy of that'd be Doctor Who, wouldn't it? Go back in time and set up the initial conditions back in 1066, so you avoid equilibrium in 1770. And he brought in stocks and reserve bank interest rates and all sorts of stuff. And he got the maths wrong. Black, who knows what he's talking about, and that's far more so than I do, pointed that out. So there are many, many other attempts to try to get around the whole thing. But the main way was to ignore stability entirely. And that's where you get arrow de Broglie, which removed dynamics completely. This whole idea that at some point in time you make all your decisions for the entire future, knowing all the various possibilities, therefore you choose equilibrium forever. And you have markets just occurring once in the entire history of the planet. All transactions happen at once, no uncertainty. Bizarre stuff. And here's somebody who, when he was first writing, was in some ways eulogizing neoclassical theory. By the time he retired, he was getting closer and closer to saying it was a disaster. And looking back, Mark Laud said that it was Walras saw it as an abstract but nonetheless realistic description of a functioning economy. And he was trying to show what the mechanism might be of reaching stability. He said by the time you get to Arrow de Broglie, GE theory ceased to make any descriptive claims at all. And this is a wonderful punchline here. He said it became a perfect example of what Robert Coase called blackboard economics, where you can write the equation on the board using terms like prices, quantities, etc., etc. But what you're writing is clearly and even scandalously unrepresentative of any recognisable economic system. I've been told by people who had de Broglie as a lecturer, rather than talking about the model of the economy when he wrote a set of equations on the board, he would say the economy is. So one of the sensible way to conclude all this is that if you can't be in equilibrium, then the economy, the model can't be in equilibrium, and there's no way the real world can be. And therefore, you should be modelling out of equilibrium behaviour. And I really see the obsession with equilibrium as the core reason why neoclassical economics is so false. So you must, if you're going to try to analytically take a look at economics at all, you have to be using dynamics. It has to be disequilibrium. And that's the rule in most sciences. And I'll give you two examples in meteorology now, with the leading, the way in which we rediscovered chaos in the 1960s, after it was first discovered by Poincaré back at the end of the 19th century. Lorenz had built a model of the economy, of a fluid flow, using differential equations. And the differential equation describes some function, x, let's say. The rate of change of it is a function of its current value. And what x now, of course, can be a vector in this case. And Lorenz had these three simple equations for describing the simplified weather system, where effectively what you had was water stored on a horizontal plane of water with a temperature gradient. So you imagine a very thin layer of water being heated from below. Okay? This is what's going to be the convection patterns that evolve in that. And these equations themselves are derived from a system of fluid flow called the Navier-Stokes equations, I believe. Now, looking at that set of equations, an economist might think, oh, well, let's work out the equilibrium then. So let's do that. There's three equations describing the rate of change, the x displacement, the y displacement, and the temperature gradient with respect to time. So let's do that. Therefore, what you do to do that is you set all those rates of change to zero. Now what you've got is a set of quadratic equations or semi-quadratic equations. We can say, well, let's work out what values give us zero. So if y is equal to x, that will be zero. And also if x and y are equal to zero, you get another way where that becomes zero. That equation there, b minus z equal to 1, will give you equilibrium because x is going to be equal to y. And this one here, that you know that x squared equals c times z, is also part of an equilibrium. And what you get is three results. You get x, y and z all equal to 0, or x and y equal to the square root of b minus 1 times c, either the positive or the negative square roots, and z equal to b minus 1. Three equilibria. Now you might hope that one of them is stable and the other two aren't. Tough luck. They're all unstable, all three. So if you start at 1 or 2 or 3, you'll stay there. But if you move even a fraction away, you'll continue moving away. That might you think if you just, a total breakdown, that you get ridiculous values for temperature and location. No, you get wild dynamics, but you don't pass out of bounds. You're still within the physical bounds of the system. And I've got a simulation program here. I'll see if I can load this and show it dynamically. It's much more beautiful to watch it than just see it graphically. Here we go. Here's the X and Y and Z locations. And I think I've got zero disturbance there. Let's disturb it slightly. Boom. Look how rapidly the X moves away as soon as I hit the disturbance button. Nothing at all happening for the first 10 seconds. And then when I get it, suddenly there's wild dynamics now, where you're seeing this is the X against plotted against the Y relationship. And over here we've got the time value of this to the X value in that case. And you get really beautiful nonlinear dynamics coming out of this process. Notice we seem to be circling something here. We began an equilibrium over here. As soon as I hit the move button, we blast miles away. Now we're rotating around what appears to be some sort of attractor, and that's the term it's now used in complex systems analysis for a point like that. Not an equilibrium, but an attractor. But they're moving away from it. Continue moving away from it. Now it's going to break down completely because it's going to go outside of bounds. And suddenly, then it's over here, but then it's back over here again. And you could lose a large amount of money trying to gamble on which of those two circles is going to float around at different times, because you really cannot pick which way that process is going to go. And that'll go on indefinitely. It won't stop down. It will never reach equilibrium. In fact, there are three equilibria. You can see them. One of them, obviously, in the tight little circle here, one up here, and one right in the middle. All three are what are known as repellers in the literature rather than attractors. So the tiniest push and you're out of equilibrium, but it doesn't break down. Those are the sorts of cycles you get. And when you look at the pattern overall, you get a beautiful pattern like this coming out of it. And this is one reason that Lorenz coined the expression that the flapping of a butterfly's wings in Latin America can cause a cyclone in China, because the pattern here looks a bit like the wings of a butterfly. I think that's the reason why. I'd like to find out from Lorenz himself one day. Now the economy is just as cyclical as the weather, so we need cyclical models for how the whole thing behaves. And they've been developed all right, there are plenty of them, but most of them aren't done by neoclassical, so they just can't think outside that square of equilibrium. So post-Keynesians do Caldwell, Goodwin, some Marxists, Schumpeter himself, the great evolutionary economists, people like Carl Chiarella from UTS in Sydney, and even economists, Ponzi, no relation to Charles Ponzi. And my favourite, the one that I do all my work using, is Goodwin's 1967 growth model. And this is based on a verbal cyclical model in Marx's Das Kapital. And you talked about it starts off by saying, let's say there's a rise in the price of labour. That means that profit will fall, less investment occurs. With less investment, unemployment rises. Unemployment rises, wages fall, and you get back to where you started again. The cyclical model in Marx. And Goodwin took that and said, well, that looks a bit like a predator-prey model. You start from high wages, get low investment, causing low growth, which is your rising unemployment. Wage demands fall, profit share rises, rising investment gives you high growth again. You get the high employment, high wages, you get the cycle that keeps on repeating. And mathematically, this is what it looked like. The percentage rate of change in employment was the growth rate minus productivity and population growth. And the percentage change in workers' income share was the real wage minus productivity. And those are the expressions there. There's the change in employment rate. There's the growth rate, productivity, population growth. There's the rate of change, the change in workers' share of income, real wage growth minus productivity. That's the logic there. You put that together, and what you get out of that is a model that's cyclical. Rather than reaching equilibrium, there's an equilibrium here. You'll see it in the limit cycle. It looks like here between wages and employment share of output. With cycles, it doesn't reach equilibrium. It's called a model of cyclical growth. So capitalism is cyclical. You can model it, and it's possible to do all that stuff using the advanced tools we have today. And you'll find plenty of thinkers who work in that area, particularly econophysicists. Now, I've got a few criticisms of econophysics as well, I'm afraid to say, but they have no problem at all with handling disequilibrium dynamics. And again, Macaulay, one of the strongest critics of neoclassical economics and developers of alternative approaches in econophysics, he says, you take the two, they're totally different. Economists have tried to ape physics, but they're nothing like it. And he said the economy is necessarily out of equilibrium. And again, they say, I think they've had some failing in how well they've done it. There's problems about just trying to replicate physics literature in economics again, rather than truly building up alternative economics. But they start by saying that we're trying to understand markets, not say how they should behave, it's how they actually behave. And Macaulay's book is well beyond me in mathematical ability. Macaulay's actually arguing that we should abolish all courses in micro and macro and teach all the mathematics you need to handle physics as a basis for doing economics. But he says, throw the whole thing out. There's nothing in there that is worth using. And that's from the point of view of somebody whose mathematical ability trashes any neoclassical economist you care to put up against him. But I'll give the last word to John Black, who's probably the person who had most influence on me in developing my approach to economics. And he made the comment that you should never treat competitive markets as if they're on the balanced growth path. Forget it, let alone static equilibrium. So instead, capitalism has a natural tendency to undergo oscillations, and that's something which you've confirmed theoretically as well as being obvious for the last 200 years of empirical data, is that it's about time we realise the actual facts of the system in which we live and try to model those disequilibrium dynamics rather than living with a fantasy of the system in equilibrium. And at that point, I can let you guys get out of here. Thanks very much.